4. Year 1145, the Great Loss. Things started to fall apart when Diardan, the prophet of doom and truth, grew in popularity and established a following of several 10,000 men and a handful of women. He claimed to be from the other side of the divide and to have been visited by God himself. God appeared in his room at night and bade him rise and hear the truth. This is how his conversation with God went. God. Kneel before me, slime. Hell dweller. Stink in the nostrils of the great God who holds in his hand your extinction. Kneel, less than a worm. Tremble, smudge on existence, twisted and unholy scab. Diardan. Speak, O Great One. I am your servant. God. You are no servant of mine, puss of call. You are less to me than the half remains of a worm discarded in a bird's unfinished meal, left in a gutter to dry, rot, and stink. Do not bother me with cries of servant, nor speak useless flatteries in my ear. Diardan. Yes, Lord. God. But I will make you a tool. Those in this hell must be taught you it is they have offended in their sin. They must be made to feel my wrath. The time has come that they are to be scourged. You will be like a whip in my hand. You will be the sword in my clenched fist. You will bring them to punishment. The days of this peace in hell are ended. Kill them again and again. Rape them, torture them, cause them pain and fire. Leave not a moment of peace. Teach them the wrath born of their sins and rebellions. Strike them when they are awake. Smite them when they are asleep. Cut without mercy. Slice without pity. The day is now. Teach them the horrors of a just God. Diardan. It will be done. And so the Diarites spread like a pestilence. Their numbers increased under the promise of a bright heaven to come when they had scourged hell to the utmost. Their numbers swelled to thousands in a year. They made recruits across the gulf, on both sides of the library. Never before had we seen such terror. They hunted in packs of 10 to 30 men and occasionally a few women. They were bound by oaths to cause as much hurt as they could. If you did not join, they would keep you prisoner for days. Engaging in torture. I will not describe it. It is beyond my ability. We became like animals. We ran. Hiding. Running. Watching both sides of the library, for the two sides worked together to hunt us down. We just wanted to travel to where there were no people, but the Diarites kept the borders of the four directions carefully guarded. One day, in this time of terror, two people popped out of one of the stairwells near where we were enjoying a meal. Their faces were stretched in unmistakable terror. They looked at us and screamed, "Run!" We knew why. We did not need any other warning. Rachel and I bolted. We ran to the left as fast as we could. We could see across the divide that the Diarites on the other side were directing the pack on our side to our location. We ran faster, our legs pumping like sprinters. Suddenly, in front of us a gang poured out of a stairwell. We ground to a halt and turned the other way, sprinted into another nearby stairwell, and headed down. We flew down the stairs with the animals panting hot behind us like wolves. We raced down to another level and went right. We should have gone left. If I had one wish to make in this eternity of madness, if I could have one prayer answered in this empty place, it would be that we had turned left instead of right. Why? Why? Has been my question ever since. We were surrounded. Another gang poured out of the stairwell in front of us, and we were surrounded. Their eyes were terrible, their countenances radiating nothing but fierceness and hatred. They moved slowly toward us, armed with clubs and spears made of cow and water buffalo bones. Rachel turned to me. She seemed surprisingly calm. "I love you," she said, a beautiful smile on her face. Then she climbed up the railing and jumped. Several arms reached out to stop her, to hold her back, but they were too late. Many arms grabbed me, however, and held me fast against the railing. I watched her fall. She did not scream, she just fell downward, down, down, and down. The Diarites all watched with gleeful cheers and laughter as she got smaller and smaller, until as an infinitesimal dot she merged with the ever-present vanishing point and winked out of my existence. My only joy was gone. "I love you too," I said to the empty air below me. I was hit over the head with a bone and saw nothing but blackness. When I woke up, I noticed I had been moved and was looking under one of the beds in a sleeping room. Then I felt a sharp pain, and everything went black again. I woke up again, noticed the same perspective I'd seen before, heard a whistle of something swinging through the air like a baseball bat, and darkness again. This continued for 37 days, which for me lasted only a few seconds. Thinking in bits and pieces over the course of more than a month was new to me, but time and practice brought increased efficiency of thought. I had about 6 seconds before I was clubbed. about 2 of which was spent in orienting myself by recalling where I was in the thinking process, then with the remaining 4 I deliberated on my situation. Of course, to me, the month passed in only 3 minutes of consciousness, but during that 3 minutes I hatched a plan and reached a point where I was ready to execute it. Upon awakening, I rolled as quickly as I could in the direction away from my invisible attacker. Then, having secured some distance between me and my attacker, I rolled and leapt to my feet, and turned quickly to face my assailant. He was clubbing down with a large calf-eye bone and was startled to find me gone. I was not surprised to find myself in one of the small rooms next to a bed, but here sat my assailant, rubbing his eyes. Well, you got away. At least I beat Higgins' record, but not even close to Barley's. The man stood up and looked at me. Want some coffee? There were a few other people getting up, a few going to the bathrooms, and some making their way out to the kiosk. I suddenly noticed that near every bed was a crumpled body, lying still, its head bashed in and fresh blood pooling on the floor. I felt sick at the sight. What were these people doing? Maybe some orange juice, I said suspiciously. At that the man shrugged and motioned for me to go out to the kiosk. Don't try to get away, he cautioned. You're a slave. A slave, I asked. Indeed, you've been adopted by the Brotherhood. You will serve us, or you will be used as a morning sacrifice as you have for the past month. As the Master teaches, to murder a sinner in the morning is the start of a blessed day. I was speechless. There's a chance to escape both these fates, and that is to join us and undertake the oath. One of the teachers will instruct you with the other arisers this morning after breakfast. Go grab something for breakfast, and with that he marched into the bathroom. I stood there, stunned. Death lay all around me, but those still living seemed not to care. They stepped and maneuvered around the many bodies like it was a normal morning. I walked out of the room and came up to the kiosk and ordered an orange juice. Bodies were everywhere. People were crumpled in the hallway. Fresh pools of blood seeped under many of the twisted bodies. I saw one man being beaten by several others. They beat him until he fell to the ground, where they kicked him until he was dead. There seemed to be no malice in their actions. It was as if they were almost bored, going through a morning ritual that needed to be done, like brushing their hair or ordering a meal from the kiosk. I walked over to the railing and peered over, thinking of Rachel's last jump, which for me had only been a few minutes ago, but I knew in reality had been weeks ago. A wave of sadness and loss spread over me just as a voice said, "Don't think about jumping. We'll catch you before you get a foot on the railing. Then we'll torture you in ways you would find rather unpleasant. The great thing is, every day we get to start fresh. We have people we've tortured for over a year. Great sinners, of course. They deserve it. It's God's great work." I stared at him like he was a madman. "You'll get used to it. Their screams, I mean. It's all God's work." He looked uncomfortable for a moment then turned away. He stood in silence for a minute and then turned to me again. "Let's go." He led me to a stairway. I was seated on one of the steps that led upward with about 4 other men. I had not seen any women yet, but I'd heard some Dialites were women. Not many, but a few. A man came in and stood in front of us, his back to the hallway. He looked no different than any of us, with the same haircut and clothes we all had. I could not tell if he was a prisoner or a captor until he proclaimed, "I am Diardan." My blood ran cold. My stomach lurched into my throat, and I felt as if I were choking. Here was the man who had caused years of pain and suffering to thousands. Here was the man who had forced Rachel into the chasm. Here in front of me, only a few feet away, was the man of my worst nightmares. My fists clenched, as rage boiled inside me. Listen to my words and be saved from this place. Ignore me and you will suffer beyond anything you thought possible. I am God's mace. I am his calipers, his judgment. I will not sicken you with all his words. He was arrogant, full of his own importance. He could speak of nothing but his glory in the world to come. It was mad. Was madness possible here? Apparently. When he finished he said, smiling, "Here is the decision you must make. You can join us and inflict pain and suffering, or any let the moment hang. You can be one of those upon whom suffering is inflicted. If you do join us, you will be assigned a client, someone who has refused the offer you now receive. To your charge you must make this place a hell to the fullest ability of your prophetic power. You must convince me you have made a sinner suffer to the greatest extent of your abilities. Don't worry, you will be trained." He droned on, but behind him the 2 guards standing beside him left for a moment. From the stairs on which I was sitting, I could hear screaming in the hall, and the 2 guards bracketing Diardan had first turned to watch, and then walked toward the commotion leaving no one between Diardan and the landing, the hall, and the railing. I did not hesitate. I had never been filled with such a sense of rage and vengeance. He had taken Rachel. He had tortured my friends. He had destroyed our peace. All of this rationalization occurred later. In that second that I saw the clear shot, I did not hesitate. My month of learning how to think in the few seconds after awakening in the morning served me well at that instant. I leaped from the step and with the speed of a linebacker picked up the low creature with all the strength born of Rachel's loss and launched us both over the railing. I had him around the waist and did not let go as we tumbled into the great divide between the two walls of books. He was kicking frantically and screaming that he would kill me. And he did. I had him around the waist, and he leaned back and grabbed my head and gave it a quick hard twist, breaking my neck. In the morning we were still falling. I was a little disappointed, because I knew we were traveling down at about 100 miles an hour, and I hoped that after a day and night we might have hit the bottom. The great fear that it might be bottomless welled up in me. I suppose it was that fear that had kept so many of us from jumping before. I estimated we had traveled 1,500 miles, and still no bottom. My enemy was still with me. He was about 200 feet above me and was in a parachutist's dive, spread-eagled and looking right at me. I was still winging my hands like a chicken tossed from a barn and doing occasional flips, but he seemed in control. I suppose he had had all day to practice, while I was falling as dead and helpless as a crash test dummy. His look was one of pure and absolute hatred. He maneuvered a little closer and started screaming at me what appeared to be a well-rehearsed speech. "You maggot. Do you know against whom you fight? Dog. You fight against God. Against God." He could not finish. He let out a scream of rage, folded his arms to his side, and dove straight at me, head first. I tried to flap out of the way, but whereas he seemed to be a guided missile, I was completely out of control. Our heads collided like two hollow melons. When I awoke, it took me a long time to find him. I tried to look around, but I was still not in control, so I used his trick and spread out my arms, and found I was stabilizing. With my perfect recollection of the past, I thought of pictures I had seen of skydivers and tried to mimic the impression I had of their falls. After an hour or so I was doing quite well and could even control my direction. Dire Dan, I finally noticed, was about 300 yards below me. It made me sick to think when we hit the bottom I would have to deal with him there, but it also occurred to me Rachel would be there too. So would others who had been forced to jump because of this evil man's gangs. I figured when we hit I would have lots of allies. My enemy was trying hard to spread himself out and slow his fall. He was heavy and built more muscular than I and apparently with less friction he had fallen a little faster. He would occasionally look at me and scream things I could not hear, but I too had learned to slow down. Through the day I started feeling pretty hungry and thirsty. We flew down, and I watched as my nemesis slowly drifted further and further away. I kept dangling my arms so I was flying away from him, and we seemed to be drifting in different directions. It was a strange feeling, falling for so long. The wind roared in my ears, but there was a peace to it, a relaxing sense of freedom I'd never known before. I was enjoying it, I had to admit. Enjoying it immensely. New experiences in hell were few and far between, and I was having a ball. Once I hit bottom, I planned to climb back up with Rachel and jump again. Floors flew by at an astonishing rate. I could see people occasionally stop and stare at me. Some looked on in pity, others in amusement, some with the expression that plagued those in hell, boredom. I was surprised to see so many people, because I knew I had been falling a long time. Did the travelers of 52 make it this far down? How far to the bottom? Just before the lights went out, I caught my last glimpse of Dire Dan. He was just a pinprick far, far below me, and we were separated by a great distance. As complete darkness gathered around me, I had a strange feeling of safety. I stayed awake for hours, but just before dawn, that inevitable moment through which no one in hell has ever been able to stay awake, that strange hour when books are returned, the dead revived, and all wounds healed, I fell asleep and did not wake until the turning on of the lights. Dire Dan was gone. I was never to see him again. Nor has anyone I have ever met since. He, like me, is lost in the library. Alone. I wonder, does he still feel he is the fist of God? I was getting very thirsty. I was hungry too, but the thirst was the worst. Throughout the day I passed hundreds of drinking fountains and kiosks and could do nothing but watch them fly by. My mouth was parched and my tongue felt thick in my mouth. I tried to take my mind off things by practicing my flying. I found that by pulling my arms inside my smock and bowing them out under the fabric I could get pretty good control of my direction. I learned to increase or decrease my speed and get some measure of navigation, but the downward motion dominated everything I did, and even when I was getting some horizontal movement, I was still hurtling downward at an amazing rate. I remembered that in air, there was a limit to how fast you could fall because of friction. I recalled with my perfect memory that it was at around 120 miles per hour. As the day came to a close, my thirst was unbearable. All my bones were aching. I fell asleep and dreamed of drinking. But no matter how much I drank in the dreams, the water did not seem to slake my thirst. My throat continued to ache, so I would try to drink more, but nothing would change. I woke up many times in the night so thirsty that was all I wanted. Why would God have structured this hell such that every wound would be instantly healed in the morning, but only the kiosk would slake hunger and thirst? The next 3 days were a blur. My tongue was swollen in my mouth, and all my bones ached. I thought I heard people offering me water. At one point I thought Rachel was falling beside me carrying a large pitcher of orange juice, which she was trying to pass to me, but every time I reached for it she would drift out of reach. Sleeping, dreaming, awake, all became confused. I could no longer see clearly, and everything was a blur. Finally I must have died of thirst, because I woke one morning feeling great. I was not thirsty. I could have used breakfast, but was no hungrier than I usually was in the morning. It felt wonderful after so many days of misery and discomfort. Still falling. Still flying past floors with occasional people, but they were getting sparser. Sometimes many floors would pass before I would see another group. How far down was the bottom? Shouldn't I have reached it by now? I did not want to go through another cycle of dying of thirst. I decided to try to get back into the stacks. First I moved near the wall, putting my hands into my smock, and tried to slow myself by pushing my hands against the wall. It didn't work. I only seemed to push myself away from the wall. I realized I was just going to have to Superman onto the floor, which would require some pretty good horizontal speed because I would have to move horizontally into the 8-foot space between the railing and the ceiling of the floor above. So I had to move about 2 feet across during an 8-foot drop. I was moving way too fast for that, and even with my smock bowed into a wing framed by my arms I wasn't getting that much horizontal direction. But I had to try, I knew, otherwise I would never learn how. I stretched and angled myself to try a glide. I was not doing too badly, I was flying right next to the railing, but was still falling too fast to get into that 8-foot span. I kicked out my leg nearest the railing and managed to get it inside. It hit the railing with such force that it felt like my leg had been ripped off, and sent me spinning. My leg was broken, and my femur had been torn from my hip. The tumbling did not help the pain. I had never been in that much pain in my life either on earth or in hell. I went into shock and mercifully passed out. When I woke up later that afternoon, the pain was unbearable. I had to do something, so I maneuvered over to the railing and stuck my head out, hitting the railing as it flew past. The next morning I felt fine. All was healed, but I was still falling. I decided I would try again. I maneuvered myself next to the railing and tried to get as much of a horizontal vector as I could. This time I had a better plan. I kicked my leg out as before, and it hit and broke again, but as I spun around, I tried to throw my arms around the railing on the next floor down. Though it felt like they too were torn from the sockets, I swung my legs around and into the space between that floor and the one below. I got them both in and was going slowly enough that I actually hung from the railing by my knees like a child on a monkey bar for a moment or two. But I was not inside the floor, and with 2 broken arms and a broken leg, I dropped again into my fall. I did not have to wait long, though, before I banged my head on the railing to forget the pain. I tried the same thing again the next day, and almost got inside. If my back had not broken, I might have managed to land. The following day, by improving my horizontal direction and slowing myself down by using my arm and leg on the wall, I finally did it. I landed on the floor. I had broken both legs, both arms, and mercifully my neck. But lying there, with feeling only in my head, I could see I was on the floor. I had stopped falling. I would have danced if I had been able to feel my legs. I passed out but woke up late in the afternoon and found a man staring at me. I could tell I was lying in a pool of blood and must have looked aside with my arms and legs lying twisted and broken in a heap. I could not speak, but I moved my jaw. He looked at me, clearly wondering what had happened. Then he asked kindly, "Were you beat up?" I could answer nothing. He saw my struggles and squatted beside me. Blinked twice for no and once for yes. I blinked once. He scratched his head and said to himself, "How did he get into this mess?" "Did you do it to yourself?" he asked. I hesitated, not sure how to answer, but blinked twice and then blinked once. Sort of, he asked. I blinked once. I was starting to lose consciousness again, and he noticed I was starting to drift. Would you like me to kill you? He asked hurriedly before I slipped away. I managed a weak smile and blinked once. I woke up in a bed. I just stared at the ceiling and enjoyed the feeling of cozy security it gave me not to be falling. I was alone in the room and wondered where the man I had met yesterday had gone. I jumped out of bed and made for the kiosk. I had eggs, bacon, ham, pancakes, and a carafe of orange juice. It was marvelous. While I ate, I did not think of anything but the food and the sweet feel of liquid running down my throat. It had been so long since I'd had a chance to just sit and think. The diarrheitis had killed me so frequently since my capture I'd forgotten what it was like to sit down to a meal and simply enjoy the pleasures of eating. After breakfast I looked around. I could not see a soul. The place was still and silent. I wondered how far I had traveled down. Miles and miles it must have been, but there was no way to know. I looked over the edge and was saddened to think I was going to have to continue my fall soon. I had to strike out for the bottom again to find Rachel. I knew she would be waiting for me at the other end of this horrible fall, and I had to find her. Still, I was not cheered at the prospect of falling again. It had been so hard to escape from the free fall that the thought of returning was unnerving. I idled around the rest of the day, opening a few books and tossing them over the side. They were all gibberish of course, but I kept going through the motions of hunting. After a nap and a late lunch, I was startled to see a man approaching. When he got closer, I could see it was the man who had put me out of my misery yesterday. "Hello," I called as he neared. "Thank you for helping me yesterday," he shrugged. "I expect you'd do the same for me." "Of course," I said and invited him to sit down by the kiosk. He was carrying a pillowcase with a book in it. He sat it carefully beside him and sat down with a sigh. He looked at me with a sidelong glance. "You're a long way from anyone else. Are you searching for the first floor too?" I nodded vaguely. "Sort of, but I'm taking a break." I learned he had been traveling downstairs for years. It had been over 3 weeks since he had met anyone. "In fact," he said, "I continued on after I had moved you to the bed, but started back this morning after thinking about your condition. What happened to you?" I was afraid there might be some of those strange violent gangs about. When I explained about my escape, fall, and attempt to get on the shelf stacks, he was doubly amazed. "I've often thought about making the jump to find the bottom. But I suppose I was never sure enough there was a bottom, you know. There always were those who said there was none." He had never heard of the diarrheitis, which I was glad to learn. Their influence had been so profound in my area of the library I was afraid it had spread everywhere. As I explained their views, he shook his head in wonder and sadness. "So you're from way up there. You fell for what, 7, maybe 10 days? At over 120 miles an hour. You've really covered some distance. I'm envious. That's over 30,000 miles. Wow, and the top floor is higher than that. Who would have guessed?" I smiled. "I thought I would have hit the bottom before this, too." As was the custom in hell, we exchanged accounts of our lives on Earth, our adventures in hell, and such stories as passed the time with others in this endless afterlife. At dinner he introduced me to a delicious Korean dish, made of sliced beef, dumplings, and a ginger sauce. This was a dish I would have to remind myself of on occasion. "What book have you found?" I asked. He smiled and pulled it out. "I found it on the 7,322nd floor down from Prime," he said, which meant nothing to me as his Prime was clearly not mine. He opened the book to a page he had marked with a napkin and handed it to me. I was stunned. It read, "Breath comes to me in bursts of joy. Stones retched out bloody worms, worn red with the passing of licking patterns of salt. Y signal Wu 8 and XXKJOP alms, KKK. I'd never read anything of such profound clarity in the library before. Tears rolled down my face, and I looked up at him in gratitude. "Wonderful, isn't it?" he said. "It's 2 sentences that are grammatically correct. They make sense. This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. It's poetry." I was wild with joy. I hugged the book and kissed its cover and passed it reverently, if somewhat reluctantly, back to him. "Thank you," I said. "You've given me some hope I haven't had in a long time." He nodded and without another word walked to the nearest stairwell and started down. He had told me there was a large group of people about 3 weeks' journey straight up. Entering the same stairwell he had just started down, I started up. I had lots of time to think as I climbed up stairway after stairway, floor after floor. Mostly I thought about Rachel. I worried that after all this time she might still be falling. Or maybe she had escaped as I had, but how would I ever find her if she did? If I started falling again, I could fly past her at night and never find her again. Maybe I had already passed her? For the first time since my arrival, I thought again of praying. I needed help far beyond what I could take control of, and prayer seemed the only measure I could take. But who would I pray to? This God of the Zoroastrians? A God who would send me to a place like this? What help would he be, if he was? I didn't know. I had no way to find out. I had a vague hope that the people thousands of miles below the groups I knew would be different from those I already knew, especially the Diorites. How delighted I would be to meet someone from Africa or Asia. Someone with a different story to tell. The never-ending sameness of all those I knew somehow blended with the sameness of this hell. The same rooms, the same railings, the same kiosks, the same bedrooms with the same bathrooms, the same signs, with the same rug, and the endless stacks of books all bound with unerring sameness, seemed to match the sameness of the people, all white, all American, all died between 1939 and 2043, the same outlooks, the same haircuts, the same maddening habits. Homogeneity everywhere, endlessly stretching into an eternity of monotony. I dared wonder if I might have come to a new part of the library. Perhaps this was where the Chinese were kept. Maybe I could meet an Arab from the 15th century. But I knew deep down it was not to be. The books were full of Roman letters, I reminded myself. But maybe I would find someone from Germany. But then there were no umlauts. From England? Maybe. But somehow I feared a defining point of this hell was its unrelenting uniformity, its lack of variation from type. If there was a heaven at the end of this, it must be filled with great variety, perhaps a multiplicity of intelligent species spread across universes. Yes, heaven would be as full of difference as hell was of sameness. I thought of the mountains and forests I remembered from my life as I climbed. I thought of the intricate structure of an ant's cuticle. How delicate the song of a bird, nestled in the twisted branches of a towering pine, sounds spilling into the cool morning. I thought of the zippered feathers of a sparrow and of its patterned colors, the banded mottling of its breast, its tiny feet curled round the rough brown bark, cracked and furrowed, giving purchase to those tiny clawed feet. What I would have given even to see a cockroach in this place. It would be heralded as a treasure that could not be purchased with a king's ransom. To see its 6 legs splaying from its thorax would have been a sight worth waiting for in a line 1,000 years long. Songs would be written about its delicate multi-segmented antennae. Its wings would have inspired such poetry as to make people weep for decades at its telling. But here, deep in hell, there was nothing to match such a wonder. Such splashes of variegation were denied us. Our attempts at music were nothing but a shadow of what we enjoyed on earth, but even more than music, we missed the natural sounds. The whoosh of wind through the yellowing leaves of an oak on a cool day late in fall. The splashing of water over smooth stone in a tiny creek as it made its way down a steep mountain. Even the whistle of a train, or the screaming of a truck down the highway would have seemed like a symphony. The clomping of my feet climbing up the steps reminded me of the poverty of sensation we endured here. But on I climbed, dreaming of meeting a man or a woman from India who knew some songs I could not repeat ad nauseum. The ring of my feet striking the steps was becoming the summation of a sameness from which there was no escape. Nevertheless, I climbed on. And on. And on. It took me 4 weeks, but at last I ran into someone. I entered the floor exhausted, wobbled to the kiosk, and asked for a glass of Gatorade. The drink was ice cold, and I downed it with relish. I noticed a man sitting in the middle of the stacks just looking down into the endless emptiness of the gulf. "Hello," I said. He looked up, and I was shocked by the hollow sorrow on his face. His eyes were red and swollen, as if he had been crying for days, but now there was a coldness, a lostness more like in his stricken, forsaken eyes that frightened me. He said nothing, but after looking at me blankly, he turned away and continued staring vacantly into the gulf. I decided to leave him and retired to the sleeping room, took a shower, and went to bed. The lights were not due off for an hour or so, but climbing all day was exhausting work. In the morning the man was still there. I ate a bowl of Cap'n Crunch and some toast, trying once again to engage the man in conversation, but he remained silent. I started up again. On about every 5th story up, I left the stairwell and peeked into the stacks, hoping I would run into more people. About 10 that morning, I ran into a group of people. They were huddled in a small gathering, crying and talking in low sorrowful tones as if a great tragedy had occurred. As I approached I greeted them cautiously. One girl burst into tears. Everyone was mourning like I had never seen before in hell. In a place where there is no real death, I had seen pain, anger, hatred, viciousness, blazing insane malicious rage, boredom often, frustration commonly, love, joy, contentment, excitement, sorrow over lost love, and a host of other emotions, but not this. Not this kind of mourning. Such a striking combination of loss and unalloyed despair I had not seen since my life on earth. "What's wrong?" was all I could say. One of the men turned to me, his features a mask of grief. "Then you haven't heard." I gave a short version of my fall and landing in this part of the library. "You've come a long way," was his only comment. I made some remark about my surprise that I had not hit the bottom yet. One of the women and two of the men burst into tears. I looked at the man who was speaking and asked as delicately as I could, "What happened?" He stared at me as if I had just arrived off a boat in a foreign land. Master Took finished his calculations. Again a round of tears broke out among the gathered group. He turned to me and said, "Maybe you should go see him yourself." "I can't talk about it anymore." His voice cracked as he spoke, but he managed to add, "He's about 17 floors up. He'll tell you what's going on." There was a stony silence as I backed away and started climbing again. It only took me a few minutes to dash up the 17 floors. I walked into the hall and was stunned by the sorrow. People were weeping. Some seemed almost catatonic, staring into nothing, their faces a frozen rictus empty of expression. I saw a man and asked where I could find Mr. Took. He waved me down the hall. "Third flat down," he said stiffly. I made my way through the group of sorrowing souls. Mr. Took was sitting on his bed, his head clutched in his hands. "Mr. Took?" I asked. He looked up. He didn't answer at first, so I asked again. "What?" he said coldly. I explained I was new to the floor and was from about 30,000 miles up. He shook his head and asked sarcastically, "So there are still only white, English-speaking Americans even up that high?" I should have known. "What do you want?" He seemed distant. I hesitated. I was just wondering about the sorrow. He laughed at me and threw pages torn from a book at me. The margins were cluttered with charcoal equations, scratched out using a sharpened bone and something burnt from the kiosk. "Look at these. It will answer your question. Look at them and weep, because they are going to tell you exactly what it means to be in this hell. Look. Look." I was frightened for a minute that he was going to get violent, and backed away, but he just sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. I picked up the paper and stared blankly at the calculations, but I could not make heads or tails of them. "How long did you work on this?" I asked after his breathing had returned to normal. He lifted his head and looked at me. "What? You've been doing this a long time." I had an estimate in just a few minutes, but the exact answer has taken me a while. I did not want to believe my guess. "What are they, if you don't mind me asking?" He let out a sigh. I calculated the number of books in the library. He stopped and looked at the papers he had thrown at me. "How many are there?" I asked. "Is there a finite number?" This was one of the most discussed questions in hell. Our university, despite some people trained in calculus, had no one versed in probability theory. Had he really calculated the number of books, which was generally believed to be finite, but very large? I could feel my excitement growing. "How many?" I asked with a little more tension in my voice, realizing the implications of what I was asking. 95 raised to the 1,312,000th power. That's a lot. Right. You don't understand. In our old universe there were only 10 raised to the 78th electrons. You mean there are more books in this library than there were electrons in our whole previous universe? Way more. Then he added with an evil, mischievous look, "In fact, I've calculated the dimensions of the library. You say you're from 30,000 miles up? Did you wonder when you would hit the bottom?" I nodded slowly. He laughed bitterly. "Well, if you were somewhere near the middle of hell, you only have 10 to the 1,297,377th light years to go." I'll never forget his cold laugh. "You have over 1,000,000 more orders of magnitude light years to fall than there were electrons in our old universe." I fell back. "Rachel," I cried out. "I'll never get to the bottom." The man shook his head in disgust. "Oh. You'll reach bottom," he laughed bitterly, "just not for a very, very long time.